Thank you for that introduction, Dr. DeRucci, and I'm really excited to be here today to discuss part of my PhD research, which has evaluated different types of acidifiers as well as through different stages of production. And so today I have summarized that in a presentation discussing the implementation of acidifiers in different stages of swine production. And so to begin, what do we currently know about acidifiers? Acidifiers are thought to reduce the pH of the gastrointestinal tract, which can lead to multiple benefits, including increased nutrient digestion, improved growth performance, and can even alter the gut microbiota. However, there's still multiple areas of research needed. And so this includes understanding the mode of action behind those benefits, identifying acidifiers that are the most beneficial to swine diets, and then validating optimal inclusion levels and feeding strategies. And so the majority of my research throughout my PhD has focused largely on these last two areas of research. And one acidifier that we've evaluated is benzoic acid. And so some of this research was presented last year, but just to combine that with the other acidifier work we've been doing, there's past literature that's evaluated benzoic acid, and we found consistent improvements in growth performance when included in the nursery period. However, there's currently a lack of literature specifically looking at different feeding programs or specifically that feeding duration throughout the nursery. And so we conducted a study looking at different benzoic acid feeding programs. And so in this study conducted here at K-State, we looked at 5 different feeding programs. And so that first feeding program had no benzoic acid throughout the entire nursery period. And then that second feeding program had 0.5% benzoic acid throughout the entire nursery. And those next 3 feeding programs are step-down programs. And so that third program steps down in phase 3 to 0.25%. The fourth feeding program stepped down to no benzoic acid. And then finally, that fifth feeding program was a complete step down through each of the 3 phases of the nursery. When looking at the overall data for the entire nursery period, we can see that there were benefits to including the benzoic acid in the nursery period. Specifically, when we look at that feeding program that had 0.5% throughout the first 2 phases and then dropped down to 0.25% in that last phase, they had an improved average daily gain compared to those pigs fed no benzoic acid, or compared to those pigs fed 0.5% benzoic acid in those first 2 phases and then removed the benzoic acid in the final phase. We also saw those improvements translate into feed efficiency. So again, we see that feeding program with the 0.5% benzoic acid in the first 2 phases and then a drop down to 0.25% in that final phase, having an improved feed to gain compared to pigs fed no benzoic acid or compared to those feeding programs that dropped down to no benzoic acid in that final phase. Therefore, as we were expecting when including benzoic acid in the nursery, we did get a positive response to having benzoic acid in the diet. However, the unique finding of this study was that reduction in growth performance that we see when we reduce or remove the benzoic acid. And so we see that here when we do the drop down of 0.5 to 0.25 from phase 1 and phase 2, but then we also see that reduction again when we remove the benzoic acid from the diet in phase 3. Therefore, we need to be cautious if we're considering removing benzoic acid from the nursery period prior to the end of the entire 3 phases. We've not only evaluated benzoic acid in the nursery period, but we've also looked at this through growing finishing pigs. And I would like to point out that the growing finishing data that I will be presenting today was all conducted on commercial farms. And so this really adds to the limited literature of implementing acidifiers on this scale in commercial farms. And so for this study, we had New Horizon Farms, and we conducted with over 2,000 pigs utilizing 3 different levels of benzoic acid. And so that ranged from 0 up to 0.5% benzoic acid, and that was fed throughout the entire growing finishing period. When looking at the overall data for that entire grow finish period, we do not see any impacts on average daily gain due to the implementation of the benzoic acid, with all of those pigs gaining right around 2 pounds per day. However, when we look at the average daily feed intake, we see this tendency for an increase in average daily feed intake as we include benzoic acid up to that 0.5% inclusion level. Due to that tendency in feed intake that we see, we did see a difference in our feed efficiency. And so we have an increase in our feed to gain as we increase benzoic acid all the way up to that 0.5% inclusion. Therefore, this would not be what we expected when starting this trial. We usually would expect maybe no benefit or maybe a positive benefit to that acidifier. And so this was definitely interesting for us to see. However, this was not the only study that we conducted utilizing benzoic acid in the growing finishing period. Another graduate student, Jenna Brom, had conducted a study also looking at benzoic acid on a commercial scale, also utilizing over 2,000 pigs with pipestone nutrition. And so similar, if you remember to the data I just presented, no difference in average daily gain, with those pigs also gaining right around 2 pounds per day. However, we actually see an in-reverse response to the study I conducted with those pigs actually having a reduction in feed intake when the pigs were fed a 0.25% benzoic acid inclusion level. Therefore, since we had that reduction in feed intake, we saw an impact on feed to gain, with pigs fed 0.25% benzoic acid having right around a 1% improvement in feed efficiency throughout that overall period. Therefore, when we look at these two studies combined, the real conclusion is that there's a lot of inconsistency in response when we're including benzoic acid in the growing finishing period. And therefore, there needs to be more research and understanding behind what types of factors are impacting this inconsistency we're seeing and how we can elicit a more consistent improvement in growth. I've not only looked at benzoic acid throughout my PhD, but also I began evaluating sodium diformate. And so this is a newer acidifier to the US market and is a salt of formic acid. And so we conducted a research study in nursery pigs utilizing different levels of sodium diformate. And this was a very exciting study for me, not only because I liked adding and looking at acidifiers, but also we had the undergrad research class also participate in this class. So we had 6 students out at the farm on weigh days and helping collect with data, as well as I had an undergrad research assistant who also helped me, Gracie Becker, on this study. So you might see them wandering around here today. So this was nice to not only add to the literature, but also get undergrads involved in research as well. But to get back to this study, we had increasing levels of sodium diformate from 0 up to 1.2% throughout all 3 phases of the nursery. And so when we looked at the data, we didn't see any differences in average daily gain or average daily feed intake, but we did see an impact on feed efficiency. So that's what I have pictured here. And when looking at the data from day 0 to 24, so this would be phase 1 and phase 2 combined, we see an impact on feed to gain, and we have a reduction all the way up to that 1.2% inclusion of sodium diformate in the diet. And so this is right around a 5% improvement in feed efficiency between those pigs fed 1.2% sodium diformate or the control pigs fed none. However, when we look at the data from day 24 to 38, we did not see any differences in feed to gain as pigs were fed increasing levels of sodium diformate. Therefore, what we can conclude from this study is we may see those benefits in feed efficiency in the early nursery period. However, they did not translate into differences once we moved into that late nursery period. However, you might first look at this data, you might consider, well, maybe I can feed the acidifier in the early nursery, get that benefit in feed efficiency, remove it to be more economical. But I would just like to remind us of that data that I first presented looking at the feeding program, and we saw that reduction in performance when we removed benzoic acid from the diet. Now, not all acidifiers perform the same, but we should conduct further research to evaluate the impacts of other feeding programs for the other acidifiers, such as sodium diformate. Furthermore, I've also looked at the inclusion of sodium diformate in finishing diets, and so this was conducted with Holden Farms, and we had increasing levels of sodium diformate from 0 up to 0.75% sodium diformate in the diet. When looking at the overall data for the entire grow-finish period, we see that there was a linear impact on average daily gain all the way up to that 0.75 inclusion level. However, we didn't see any benefits past that 0.5% sodium diformate. Additionally, we did see a tendency for an impact on our average daily feed intake, with pigs fed increasing levels of sodium diformate having a tendency for a greater feed intake. However, due to that improvement in average daily gain and tendency for an increase in feed intake, we did not see any differences on our feed efficiency for this trial. However, the really interesting data from this study is when we broke this apart by different periods, we actually saw a majority of the benefit from sodium diformate coming in the late finishing period. So that would be after day 60 or after around 180 pounds. And so there's some further investigation or research that is needed to, similar to the nursery, evaluate where is the most beneficial periods of feeding acidifiers to elicit the best responses. So just to summarize the data I presented on acidifiers, overall, we do see benefits to including acidifiers specifically immediately post-weaning and looking at feed efficiency, both with the benzoic acid and the sodium diformate. However, we do need to be cautious if we're going to remove the acidifier prior to the end of the nursery period, as we could see reductions in growth. However, this does need to be further evaluated in other acidifiers besides benzoic acid, such as sodium diformate. Additionally, when looking at growing finishing pigs, the response to acidifiers is inconsistent. Therefore, we need to further evaluate what factors in growing finishing diets could be impacting this inconsistent results with growing finishing pigs, as well as kind of evaluating the best time points to be feeding an acidifier to be most economical for producers. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Dr. DeRucci, and I appreciate all of your guys' time today.